Dr. Paula Gilligan, a senior lecturer in film and cultural studies at IATT Dún Laoghaire, Dublin, where she teaches censorship and control, contemporary media and drama. She's interested in the study of space, power and violence in contemporary culture. Recent papers include This Town Is Not Your Own, the Smithfield Protest and the Dublin Commons, delivered at the Dispossessed Symposium, Warwick in just recently in May 2022. And beginning with Salt, some cultural interrogations on Ireland, Haiti and the transatlantic for the Association of Franco-Irish Studies conference in Trinity in October 2021. She's published a number of articles on Irish themes in French cinema history. In 2019, she hosted Down Clarabone and a questions and answer here at the IFI. Handing over to Paula.
Okay, so thank you, Dennis. It is relevant that like Dennis, this film that I'm going to look at here has become an obsession in the sense that I did it for my PhD, but 20 plus years on, I'm still struggling with it. So I hope you'll bear with me on this. Okay, so just following Veronica, I think the point that Veronica is making is that looking at this early cinema, this isn't early cinema, it's 1952, but looking at Irish themed films and work in the I would say world context, would make the claim that it was very important for cinema studies as world cinema studies, which is decolonized cinema studies, to engage with Irish cinema and the Irish archive. And by Irish here, I mean with Irish themes. So I would just like to say, in terms of the War of Independence, that I have skin in the game. My grandfather, Frank McGahern, I think you may be familiar with the name, fought in the War of Independence, and my perspective is very imbued by my family. My uncle Sean wrote about that. He wrote that he said that he never spoke, that Frank Sr. never spoke much about the War of Independence. The character Mourne in Amongst Women actually isn't my grandfather, he's a composite. My grandfather was anti-treaty, and he became a civil guard at the end of the Civil War. He then experienced Owen O'Duffy's fragmentation of family and extreme masculinity. As Sean said himself, of that, I suppose the definitive statement on that, on the attitude of people like my grandfather as veterans of the War of Independence, is summed up in Amongst Women. It says that when he says, "What do we get for it, a country, if you believe them?" And we swap one crowd for another crowd, which I think sums up a lot of the ambivalence that we may experience around the War of Independence, and why the reaction to it is not that of 1916 commemorations in 2016. So my uncle says that he was still young enough to be of the generation that believed in the proclamation. So sorry, I didn't mean to say that, but I've just said it now. I'm not sure if all my slides are in order. I was kind of changing them as I went along. Okay, La Jeune Folle, I'm just going to leave the quotes up there and you can read them yourselves, okay? La Jeune Folle, The Young Madwoman, is a French film about the Irish War of Independence, Civil War, based on a book about 1922 by a woman whose pen name was Catherine Beauchamp, who was in fact known as real name was Fante Rosec, Maven, one of the Breton nationalists operational in the 1930s and during the Second World War. She wrote the book in 1941. Yves Allegret himself was part of the group Octobre that Renoir would have been associated in the 1930s. And then he becomes one of the most important figures in post-war French cinema, particularly what we call French film noir. The film La Jeune Folle was produced in post-war France, but its diegetic time is Dublin 1922. Allegre's work did enjoy a high profile, and I would suggest, although I'm not going to go into it here, that in fact it's a major influence on Jordan in both Michael Collins and The Crying Game. In two films, De Si Jolie Petite Plage, a beautiful little beach, and known as Riptide in English, and in this one, The Jeune Fall, which Susan Hayward argues merits far more attention than it has been given, especially in terms of the gender themes. Raymond Shearat has also pointed out that the kind of themes that Allegre mobilises post-war make these very seriously important films. That means that doesn't mean you have to like them, because as Dudley Andrews says, that Allegre was not a likeable director. He's a man of the left, as you can see from the Group October thing, and he wanted very much to engage with themes that were of concern to the 1930s. And this is what I'm going to argue here, is that because he works on an ensemble basis, that the auteur approach to Allegre, this film, doesn't really work. So I want to concentrate on two figures here. One, just to refer to and I'll come back to the theme of the interwar years, because I noticed that the key words for this conference so far have been informer, collaborator, and also I think the colonial issue is important, because at one and the same time France itself had been occupied, experienced occupation, but unlike the Irish, who are in Knocknagow very shouty about being colonised, the French didn't fancy referring to themselves here. And that was a crisis for left-wing resistant France post-war too, as much as for the right. But they were, so this is a strange film that what I discovered in my PhD mainly, which started with the Puritan, and by Jeff Musso, which is an adaptation of Liam O'Flaherty's novel The Puritan. The Puritan, I have said in my article on the matter, is the only film where we actually see a portrayal by no less than Jean-Louis Barrault of the interwar French Action Française, French far-right Catholic fascist, in a kind of a portrait of a manosphere, as Debbie Gang has called it, okay? An incel type, if you like. We might say a very contemporary. And that figure had two main primary enemies, and that one of them was at the top of his list of responsible for the decadence of France that needed to be saved by nationalism, by the research and nationalism. Was one of them would have been the Jewish communists would be top of his list, followed by homosexual and women. That would the French fascists would have been the targets. So I'm looking quickly at Tranere. Alexandre Tranere, as some of you may know, is a very famous set designer, and he was well known with the French poetic realist, although he didn't see himself in that category. He did Carnet's films, Quai de Brume, Remarque, and he worked with Wells, and he did The Apartment, Billy Wilder. And he's a Hungarian Jewish emigre. It's easy to forget he wasn't French. He did Round Midnight as well. And therefore he constructs a Paris as he imagines an audience will react to. Okay, so that's very important in Tranere's work. But he came back to France and he worked with Allegre on this. But as part of that, he went to Dublin. And I've just put a couple of quotes here from it. I should have banned my notes because I farted to it. That he loved Dublin, but he had that critical, empathetic eye that Tranere has as what we would call a Jewish humanist, maybe. His observations of Dublin are worth looking at. Now, I have an article in detail on that, so maybe I should not go into it there. But I want to say that that when he worked with Tony Inglis here on that trip as the research, and what he did was he kind of didn't constructed a Dublin that has few landmark site specific scenes apart from the main character played by Daniel Delorme, Catherine's journey from Houston Station to Temple Bar. And I should give you a summary of the plot, and I will in a minute. I think I have it on. No, sorry. Actually, these are not in exactly the order I was going to work them on, so I'm sorry about that. That's good. Okay, sorry. I'm just trying to see. Okay, if I can get you a summary. I had it up there, but anyway. So the story of La Jeune Fall is basically a young woman, Catherine, who's actually in an orphanage, and her brother were reared in an orphanage by nuns, and she hears her brother has died in Dublin, and she's kind of a strange character, kind of Joan of Arc, here listening to voices, very influenced by certain nuns in the picture, and kind of a Catholic man who comes to persuade her in the middle, and this is supposedly the Civil War or War of Independence, a little bit vague on the times, that she should seek vengeance for her brother. And so her brother has been killed, he says, by the head of police, British police. In fact, as it transpires, when she gets to Dublin, she goes in search of she wants help to join the movement in order to take action in revenge for her brother. And she meets Steve there, and Steve is in Sinn Féin, quasi-IRA role, and there's a big love story there. And Steve is played by Henry Vidal, who's in the romantic character. Okay, so for Tranere, sorry, I actually realised I sent you the wrong order of the slides. Anyway, apologies for that. Okay, so Tranere's business then was to try and construct Dublin that of the War of Independence, but in fact what he says is that he constructs La Jeune Fall in the form of Carnet's Quai de Brume in the 1930s French poetic realism. It's unusual though, because although there was very little money going around in the French cinema post-World War and they had to compete with Hollywood, they usually saved money by shooting in studio. But in fact they actually did some shooting in Dublin, and we can see a scene there, and in the film, which we don't have, you can see that Catherine travels up to Dublin on train from the orphanage, and then moves along the city quays to past Guinness's, and then into Temple Bar. Tranere had views on Guinness's which are at odds with some of the some of the attitudes of Guinness's, and that he saw it as an industrial, a factory, and that the conditions were very poor for workers around it, and the stink of Guinness everywhere, as he said, of the factory and of the business of it. So one of the things that that we see is that La Jeune Fall pays homage to Ford's The Informer in the way it uses fog and poster bills and the costumes of the Sinn Féin activists. But otherwise the decor is very different. The key indices of the former were the iconic signifiers of the Georgian streets of the North Dublin slums. However, nowhere are these referenced in La Jeune Fall, which to me it seems that he mostly based on the area around St. Patrick's and Cathedral, Thomas Street, and possibly up to Inchicore. So we see there that the Dublin city of the film is a city of narrow, anonymous streets, dank, gloomy, dark, and menacing. And one of the weirdest features of it, which isn't in the novel, is a band of sinister children in motley costumes. So it's not really a realist representation of Dubliner citizens. So he said that for him, Tranere, the purpose of the set designer was to help the mise en scène so that the spectator had immediate grasp of the character's psychology. The psychology of Catherine is one where Delorme, as a major important figure, if you take women's history in French film, Delorme's performance, it's supposed to be Vidal, but it's Delorme's performance that people focus on. And in this character, we have this mix of Gigi, the ingenue character, but also this sort of determination that we might read as Antigone, but is actually inflected very strangely with the Catholicism of Dublin as constructed by Tranmere. And I wanted to say that some of the features that to maybe a French audience looked okay, with the harpists in the street, they're odd, and they don't look like the ones in the American. Okay, the American is more natural, as we saw in John O'Flynn's talk earlier. The music is included as part of the diegetic. Here it's sort of odd, yeah. So one of the things I hadn't thought of the soundtrack, but I'm just going to put it in relation to John O'Flynn's thing, is that the paper, that the wearing of the green is a key theme of the Paul Mizrachi, Jewish music and composer, did the score, and the wearing the green of Informer is picked up in this, but completely kind of undercut by whistling of either police or the children, which is actually relates to Fritz Lang's Le Maudit. Those of you know from Fritz Lang, there's a huge scene of the hunt of the paedophile is done like that. So we see the Informer, we see it undercut and a very disturbing, neurotic kind of film with allegory. So I'm just, somebody tell me to when to this.
We're 15 minutes out.
Okay. So what we see then is in this that what allegory does is he draws on this strange Breton text, and we'll have a look now at Franz Rosac, but he draws on it and he uses Ireland as an allegorical space in which to investigate the themes of the occupation in France. Which at one of the themes, and I go back to what I said about my uncle's perspective on it, a country if you believe them, is that what happened after the occupation from the point of view of the left was that they failed to deliver, and the Fourth Republic was the same as the Third Republic. And Jean Calos is one of the most famous cinema historians working in French cinema studies, and he calls it 15 years of the 1930s. Okay, so after the war, they went back to the themes. And some of these themes are worth exploring. I had a piece there on Sartre and the collaborationists, which I can go into, but there's a problem with the left and women, and that's a problem of assigning collaboration and fascism as a sexuality. And it comes from Sartre, and Sartre asks in 1945, qu'est-ce que c'est un collaborateur? And David Carroll, in a brilliant book on this, on French literature and fascism, says that Sartre was trying to explain French collaboration and at the same time distance himself and other members of the resistance from it as much as possible. So they did this by treating collaboration as an illness and a social pathology similar to criminality and suicide. Now what's really strange is why do we say that Delorme, given this background and what we know, and we have people here who are historians that specialise in the role of women in the revolution in 1916 and as activists in the War of Independence. So why is this pathologised within it? There's some information on Delorme. Delorme's a very curious figure. One of the problems as well of women in cinema is that the women, like Jacqueline Audrey, one of the first kind of major film directors in France, is that she gained her apprenticeship in the 15 years during the occupation. So whether they were in the Zone Libre or whether they were actually working directly with Continental, a lot of these people who continued to make the post-World War films were working during the occupation. And Delorme herself was in the Zone Libre. So there was a hunting, as we know, of Daniel Dario and other characters, Arletti, after the cinema. Just again, we can talk about the attacks on women, you know, that the projection of the failures of the French man and also the failure to bring change. Okay, so fascism happened, the occupation happened, and the failure to bring change is what drives us. So I suppose one of the key themes here then is that we see here the tropes that we see in Michael Collins, okay? That when Catherine goes to assassinate the police officer, the chief of police in his posh Dublin neoclassical residence is how Trownair constructs it, yeah? She's Steve, against his better judgment, the hero, the sort of IRA gangster hero, comes and saves her. And he does it by the typical rape image, which is you can throw clothes over a mouth, and then he turns it around, and as a policeman approaches, he kisses her. Exactly the same scene is reproduced in Michael Collins. And it is a consent problem. So it's, and you can see that he takes the phallus, the gun off her, if you want to get psychoanalytical. And obviously, it didn't work. That didn't work so well for him. Okay, so I just very quickly say that the 1930s is the spectacle of masculinity is analysed by Jeanette Vincenzo in Pepe Le Moco, and I think it's very relevant to representations of the War of Independence that we have seen. First of all, there's an ambiguity in the relationship between the hero and the community. The male hero is the object of the look, wanted all by all the women. In La Jeune Fille, it's Steve, Steve, Steve is the cry. And is centre of attention, but surrounded by groups of people in the pubs and the streets. And then as he goes on the run, because he's blamed for the attempted assassination, but he is the one who shot Kevin. So behind him is the fact that the IRA man as ruthless and violent, who is willing to do anything. Yeah. So that's impossible to reconcile with the Steve cannot be recuperated into patriarchy, and in that way he refigures those 1930s figures like Pepe Le Moco, embodied by Jean Gabin in particular. The male revolution hero is degree zero of masculinity excess. There's a need to eliminate women in order to achieve the goal, the cause, yeah? And that the women represent the threats to virility and homosexuality as well. And Kevin the Informer is also of excess. In Kevin the Informer in Trownair's decor, the brother's room is full of Madonnas, of religious iconography. So just to say that the whole theme of Catholic female and Republican, the betrayer, is a theme of the Second World War in France, and in the post-war genre throughout it, like in La Jeune Fille, the primary friendship between male comrades is betrayed by the corrupt and manipulative father figures whose instruments are politics, devil era, and by the woman who represents the domestic sphere. So the man of action is the only reliable figure, uncontaminated, and is martyred by the instability of the female sign. Now, David Carroll would argue that Sartre's and other left-wing resistance post-war fall into that trap of this sort of locating the collaborationists in this feminine tropes, and then also they replicate in many ways the gender attitudes of the very fascists that they seek to combat. Now we will notice, I will not use the word fascist here so much as this kind of problematic masculinity and excessive masculinity. And I will finish with the fact that in today's time, that it's I haven't gone into it in great detail here, but the key influencers here on La Jeune Fille, and sorry, that's Fante Rosac Maven, but the key influencers are the Catholic Church as the croix de feu at these, there's activism that we can see into Ireland today as a type of, one of the things that is said, particularly by Caroline Campbell in a wonderful essay on 1930s far-right Catholic movements in France, is the way they created space for women to come into the picture as civic actors in a way that was denied by the left. That's very dangerous. The result of that was gynophobia combined with homophobia and abortion anxiety. I think we would see it very clearly in movements that we have at the moment, like the Countess, terrible betrayal of Markowitz, and transphobic movements. These are very connected to 1930s cultures. The revisiting of those cultures and the critique implicit in Delorme's performance and also this odd thing here around Franz Rosac that the attractions of Ireland as a text in terms of research and nationalism is something we need to watch, and that the archive, to go back to working on films, it's a masterpiece of ugliness. It has ridiculous things in it, Leisure and Fall, but what it leads you into is a serious engagement with Ireland, an Irish Catholicism, Irish nationalism, and the idea of a republic that locates Ireland as important within the war system. And therefore it behoves us to look at them, is what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. We're on us for a couple of minutes of discussion. We're up against time, as often happens. So two fascinating presentations, two very different films in some ways, but like we can see, some common themes going across them. I mean, you seem to be talking, Veronica, about, you were talking about, didn't seem to be, about the way in which Knocknagow is discussed by the British trade press. So we're getting this impression of the way in which we see an outsider's perspective on this particular Irish text that maybe marks it then for much of its existence. And Paula, you're very engaged with this film that gives us quite an insight into Ireland in the 50s. As much as in the 20s.
Yeah, and 30s.
And 30s. And now.
And sadly now. I never thought my research would be relevant to the 21st century, but yeah, I think, and I would say the same about the films that you're looking at there, the problem of nationalism and the lost dream of the inclusive republic. It is there, from France's perspective. Is actually there in England as well, So I thought.
I haven't framed that as a question. Is there a question in the room for our speakers? Yep.
Thank you both for your presentations. Veronica, I was just interested in the impact the reception of Knocknagow may have had on Willie Riley a couple of years later. Did it fall on less receptive ears because of the experience of Knocknagow?
Great question. Great question. No, really, really great question. I've looked more at Knocknagow than Willie Riley, so tentative as that was, this is going to be even more tentative. By that stage, you have what I couldn't or didn't put in here today. You have the screening of Knocknagow and Willie Riley and The Widow Malone and some of the other short films in America. So there was kind of at least two iterations of the Film Company of Ireland. There's this Nell and James one, which kind of dies when Nell dies, essentially. And then you have another group of people taking it over, and it does become very nationalistic then. And Willie Riley, as you know, is a very different film. It wears its nationalism on its sleeve. And then somehow there's I'm only trying to preach all this. There's a company that's set up in Boston, and that seems to be set up with this incredibly elusive Henry Fitzgibbon, who goes AWOL and then comes back somehow in 1919. James Sullivan has something to do with setting up of like the Irish Film Company in America, in Boston, and their whole aim is to promote the films of the Film Company of Ireland to an American audience. Somehow that doesn't happen, and then the Wharton Brothers filmmaking and distribution company in New York, upstate New York, get a hold of these films, and they somehow then have the license to distribute the films in America. And this kind of happens almost simultaneously, but kind of before Willie Riley gets distributed in England. And the whole approach of the Whartons is to sell these films. There's actually a quote I have that says, to Sinn Féin them. Okay, so the whole approach then is to say, these are films that were going to take advantage of the fact that, De Valera's tour of the States had happened at that stage. There are all these Irish societies happening. There's the Loan, which of course happens in Willie Riley as well. So I think then when Willie Riley then goes into England, it's kind of picking up on some of that, and that's problematic in England, of course, at the same time. But I think it's kind of picking up on some of that, and it's getting a bit of legs in Scotland. It gets a lot of legs in Scotland. Like, it gets, I think, more distribution in Scotland than it does anywhere else. But I think the thing with Willie Riley, which is also the thing that happens almost the same with Knocknagow, is that the personal circumstances of the film company and the film industry at the time work against this film company. You completely work against this film company. So I think initially when they started off, they had great marketing and they were able to kind of promote their films. Obviously, history catches up with them as well. But whatever this company was in Boston, and the same with the Whartons, and then their initial distributors in the UK, Davison's, based in Liverpool, they go out of business. It's like a series of tragedies when it comes to this company. So as much as I know about Willie Riley, I think it kind of managed to kind of promote itself both in the UK but more so in America as this kind of film about Irish freedom and Sinn Féin and the romance of all of that, and it somehow managed to get by on that a little bit in England but more in Scotland. But I have to look deeper, much deeper into that, as I do with this still. So but great question. I don't know yet, I guess. Sorry is my short answer. Yeah.
Other questions?
I had one. I was just very interested, and it comes back to things that came up in earlier panels, that they're actually very conservative films, at least from an economic perspective. They represent very, like Knocknagow, and it finishes with them happy enough with the landlord, like good landlords. So not very radical films yet. It seems to be from that it's still a trigger for the press, like just any reference to the famine or to any of this history at all is a trigger, and so it seems very. Is it because it's made? It seemed not as an American Hollywood film, even though there was strong reactions to them too in Ireland and England. But I'm just wondering is why that is. Why a trigger is much more than films and similar themes. Is it a problem of the Irish history specifically?
Yeah, I think it was a challenging film to adopt. I think it was a challenging novel to adopt into a film. It's so episodic, and other bits in that review in the biograph that I didn't go into. It talks about how wonderful the acting is. It talks about the scenery being really good, and it completely criticises what we would still criticise in it today, is that if you haven't read the book, if you don't know the characters, it's really hard to make sense of it. Like, I had to watch it a number of times and taking down notes and kind of trying to figure out who is who and what is what, despite the excellent and constant intertitles in it. So I think it was a challenging film or challenging novel to make into a film. And I think in doing that, they really focused, which I was hoping I was getting across in the presentation, that they really focused on how that novel had been established and the love that people had for that novel, and this notion of decency in the Irish people, and this notion of a good community, and everybody kind of joining in together, and sports. I know my colleague Siobhan Crossan has written about sports in this film as well. Sorry, my ex-colleague, currently independent. I think any kind of display of politics in it it's very soft, because I don't think that's what they were looking to do. I really don't think that's what they were looking to do. I think what they were trying to do is to say, we want to show Irish people as they are, rural and city folks. And of course, part of what Irish people are is the history of Irish people. They're not getting away from that. But they're not as interested in wearing their nationalism or their politics on their sleeves as was what I'm calling the second iteration of the Film Company of Ireland, where with the people who made Willie Riley. I think there is a difference there in the two. It's very slight, maybe, and subtle. But yeah, I think that's
Could it be that
that's my best stab at that.
the politics of this, it comes with, it's Charles Kickham's Knock the Gow. So Charles Kickham, has IRB, revolutionary, has that revolution. But the book itself is very conventional. It's not very radical in any kind of way. I don't think. But it's like that. That's enough. If you get Charles Kickham in there, and that appears before the public, then you have something radical. You have something radical, but with the strict censorship, you don't get to put actual radical representations on screen, because it'll be cut by the censor. So maybe it's enough. Maybe that's it. That's all.
It's that trace, basically, isn't it? And then the British press is, and that's why I find your work so interesting. The British press are pulling out those little traces sort of to trigger a reaction to it. But I found I should follow the French reviews spend a long time trying to say it's not a film about Sinn Féin, and in fact I accepted it. And some way I reproduced that there is that I said it was an allegory for the Second World War. But as I looked more into it and the Fantrosec background, I actually realised that it has an awful lot to say about the Breton nationalist text, which is a subtext of it, and I hadn't realised myself, has an awful lot to say about problems of that Irish people struggle in, and in recent films, Black 47 and Iraq, with their own nationalism and with violent nationalism, and what to do about it. And I think that's the press reviews are a great resource for looking at audience responses to that. But it is very troubling as well.
Is Le Jeune Fall and the Puritan? I'm fascinated by those two films. Partly because of your work, but and drawing attention to them. Why O'Flaherty? Why that?
I suppose what I'm discovering is that the secular republic is how we think of France. So the whole point of the women's brigades of the Croix de Feu, which is the Crosses of Fire, and were actually, and that's why I hear a lot of similarities now with what's Joe Duffy, so etc., with that kind of nationalism. Is that it's still completely patriarchal, but it opens for what they call the maternal instinct to move out into the civic space, and therefore female activism, which is gynophobic but weirdly obsessed with reproduction and replacement of demography post-World War I. So it creates that space, but it is so unsaid in French cinema. I think Allegret is, I would agree with Bertrand Salier that Allegret is a misogynist and represents a misogynist inflection of the left in after the Second World War. But at the same time, what the Irish thing does, and where O'Flaherty came in, and I think O'Flaherty has the right to be considered one of the greatest screenwriters we've had in Ireland, or in terms of his work. The contributions are amazing, and this film, The Puritan, is overlooked. Jeff Musso is it's an amazing piece of work, but it does open the space for an engagement with Irish Catholicism, not as insular, theocratic, primitive, and so on, but actually within an international Catholicism. Also, the Church's clawback, which is central to the War of Independence, of the dangerous moment. The really dangerous moment is the 1916-1913 connection. So that is, which saves us now in some ways, and saved us from the Fantrosec problem, the Breton nationalist problem, is that they hadn't that third solution. They had in their early days, but they didn't have that third solution of socialism, feminist socialists as well. Very important. So sorry, that's a bit of a... But what I'm saying is I think that that the Irish space in France is a reflection on the Republic. I would also argue that for England, that England lost its revolution in the 16th century, and that the Irish space does create spaces for them, you know. But Ireland is not Britain's subconscious, and it's not France's subconscious either. It's to quote
a good point
Herbert.
to break on. Thanks so much, Paula. Thanks, Veronica, for
Thank you
your
very much.